There's an associative relationship between high-performance building development and just people who also just do a really good job in choosing buildings, financing buildings, whatnot. And A, do you think that's true? And B, does it matter? Because if it's associative, that's also very important. But
well, it's still early to know the exact answer. Considering the small sample, we're talking about a few lead properties that transacted. If we had 100 properties, then we can make a better assessment. Considering that the lead properties did not transact as frequently as Energy Star or other properties, again, the jury is out. It's still out. We still need more data to make an informed decision about that.
Okay.
What government incentives maybe nationally need to happen to really make it economically viable to retrofit these buildings, so these clunkers, which we can't demo now, can become Energy Star, become more energy efficient? Whether they become green or not is probably irrelevant, but can they become more energy efficient and competitive?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is I think there are a tremendous number of buildings out there where the economics already make sense and they don't need government incentives. One of the biggest obstacles, and we've been talking about it a lot in some of the other forums, is just financing of the retrofits. So there's a lot of projects sort of sitting on the shelf where there's a very attractive financials in terms of energy cost reduction for those projects, but financing is an obstacle. I'd also say that there's thousands of existing buildings out there where people sort of default to, and many of them need some kind of capital infusion and upgrades. But even ahead of that, there's an awful lot of them that could benefit from just low cost, no cost operational improvements, and we really need to get started there while some of these other things begin to materialize.
I just maybe give it a little bit of a different perspective. I tend to kind of categorize incentives into sort of micro versus macro incentives that are required to make something like this happen. And I think there have been a lot of things done at a micro level, whether it's local or state or even federal, where there are ways to push some buttons to create incentives around very specific things. But frankly, I think the easiest thing for the federal government to do, maybe not easy is the wrong word, the most important thing for the federal government to do is to figure out ways to continue to attack this in a bigger way. What's the best way to restabilize real estate markets, create jobs, create economic vitality, where there are tenants out there that are wanting more space, there are companies that are comfortable with making a decision to expand or move or relocate, and there are investors that are comfortable with the risk environment in a way that allows them to invest more freely in what's going on. Now, having said all that, I'm sure there are ways to be more surgeon-like around regulation, although I'm not sure many people would ever use surgeon-like and regulation in the same sentence, but there are ways to do things. But some of the examples that haven't worked quite so well are things like the PACE bond approach to incentivizing some financing of retrofits or financing of things. There's a very logical and with the benefit of hindsight, predictable backlash that in some ways the unintended consequence of that idea is that you've by priming every other part of the capital stack in a building, you're actually creating disincentives around the free market starting to really do what needs to be done to make this stuff happen. So you've got to be very careful about those unintended consequences. I knew that would be a little provocative, so.
Let me also take the prerogative of the moderator, since I used to work for an organization where I had, as a part of my job description, managing the risk of there being regulation, and now I work at an organization where regulation is not such a dirty word. There is no question that one of the incentives that I think, or regulatory requirements that I think has been effective, will be effective, is New York City's requirement that buildings of a certain size actually do an audit and determine what kind of opportunity they have for retrofits with a blended 5-year payback. So looking at your entire portfolio, assessing what those are, and originally as proposed, it would have actually required that people do those paybacks, and a variety of more progressive building owners in New York actually were supportive of that, but it didn't pass. But still, just even requiring people to know and to be in effect on notice that there are all these opportunities that they're not taking advantage of, I think is powerful.
I'm in residential construction, and we are doing a bunch of LEED for homes projects. One complaint I've heard was that commercial, you guys do modeling, but you actually never do the performance testing. And when it is done, they actually underperform significantly from what you guys model. Where does that come in responsibility of actually doing performance testing on buildings, not just modeling?
Well, and I think just to skip ahead a little bit, and a little bit related to the last question, I think one of the things that can really stimulate the free market in terms of these retrofits is requiring building owners to publicly disclose the performance of the building, as they're doing in Europe. Because once you have that level of transparency, then they're held accountable that the building should perform as it was designed, and owners can't hide, and the poor performing buildings will be much more motivated to then go out and invest in these retrofits. So I do think from a regulatory standpoint, requiring a disclosure on performance of buildings can solve a lot of these, including the one that you described, in terms of demonstrating that the retrofit work or even the building is performing as it was designed to, and not just getting credit for having a good design.
It does go beyond regulation also, and again, I'll ask you to take a look at what we've done at Greenprint, because it's really driven by that measurement and performance question. And it's not being forced by regulators anywhere. And the idea behind Greenprint is to get the industry to get out in front of this, which usually is best practice, and not wait to be regulated, but actually lead. Because what is happening and why it goes beyond public policy is that, again, I think I mentioned it earlier, the capital, whether it be the pension funds or the private investors or the insurance companies or the shareholders of public companies, are looking for ways to measure their real estate partners in terms of energy performance, not just because they think it's socially important, again, but also because I think people intuitively believe that there is a correlation between energy performance and value. Now, that's, again, not easy to prove. We've looked at some ways where you can start to prove it. Roger pointed out one of the very simple skeptical responses around it, because data is in short supply, and it takes time to accumulate the data. It takes time to defend the data against different factors. And this is just another one of the steps, I think, in the right direction around your question of measurement and performance.
One thing that also help is on the way, I should say help is on the way, because every day $500 million worth of commercial construction enters the LEED pipeline, of the commercial building world around the world. And for all these new buildings that are being LEED certified, they're required to share data on the actual performance of the building with us. And we believe we're going to have a gold mine of analytics that we can do on that data. And we also believe that over time, the LEED requirements will evolve so that people will in effect both have a new building label, but then they'll also have some scorecards that they'll put next to their new building label. And if their scorecard is, if we're in 2020 and their scorecard is back in 2011, people are not going to be very impressed with that. But if it goes up and it continues to be high performance, then I think we're going to see more transparency on that. Next question.
You mentioned PACE bonds, and like you said, one of the big things with that really hurt the program is Fannie and Freddie, decided they weren't going to take that. And so, one of the big, issues with a lot of these owners who are capital constrained, they see better uses for the capital in terms of placing in other parks, and so they look for debt. And then the issue comes, within the capital stack, how do you guys see any kind of financing platforms, and where would that debt fall in the capital stack, and what kind of returns would someone who's placing that debt require, and would it be secured? Would you secure it by the improvements, and how would you value that kind of thing?
Very good. You want to take that very unsophisticated question, Chuck?
It's a great question, and very well put. I think you've hit one of the significant issues right on the head, and there are a lot of unanswered questions right now, partly because of the state of the market. But there are also a lot of people working on creative solutions to that. But financing that gap is really going to be critically important to making this stuff happen. And look, there are, again, ways to incentivize and regulate and have policy around that. But again, I think it does come back to sort of underlying value ultimately. And whoever is going to fill the gaps in the capital stack, and they definitely exist. I like to call it an equity gap now because I think, and I said this on a panel this morning at ULI, ultimately I think it does come down to the equity. It's very hard to look at a commercial bank who on one hand is being sort of asked to help stimulate the economy, but on the other hand is being severely constrained by regulation on the financial risk side of the equation. They are not, even in a normal environment, which this is not, they are not paid to take risk that they can't quantify. And their constituents, shareholders, and other stakeholders, just don't want them to do that. We've seen the downside of that, as we've worked through the credit crisis that we just experienced. So to think it's going to be taken care of conventionally, I think, is a mistake. But in some ways, for the real estate industry, and people don't like to hear this maybe, but the ratio of equity to debt is changing as we speak, and it has to change. It got out of whack, way out of whack, and so now this issue kind of falls in that recalibration of the capital stack. But there are non-conventional sources out there, venture capital and private equity. I made the comment this morning, which isn't necessarily one that the supply side of the equation likes yet, but the suppliers of technology, those who are selling new Windows systems, those who are selling those interesting things that are in the toilets at the at the Durst projects, they play a role as well. There's non-real estate financing, and can be seller-provided financing by the manufacturers who have the capability to do it and get some of the benefits, obviously, because they sell their technology into the market. I think that's part of the way that gap gets filled. But from a real estate point of view, it does have to be, I think, the equity that steps up and says, again, longer-term value, longer-term competitiveness is really what's going to make this, make this important. And the equity is going to have to take some of that risk. And I don't think it's debt, because we really don't want to go back to that high leverage scenario that we've already experienced. It is the equity in one form or another that fills that gap. And we think, a lot of the things we're talking about in terms of value, and again, it's a slow process again, because a lot of people want to see the proof. I went out on a limb and called people cowards today who weren't willing to do this without the proof. But venture capital suggests, sort of that somebody has to be willing to take that risk and believe that there's a long-term return on doing that. So